In the vast expanse of the Galactic Military Academy, where beings from 100 worlds train to defend civilization itself, there exists a simple truth that most overlook. The deadliest weapons are often those that appear most humble. While cadets from advanced species mock primitive human steel, they fail to understand that some blades carry more than just an edge. They carry the weight of worlds, the memory of blood, and the promise of victory against impossible odds. Today you will witness how a single human instructor's weathered sword, dismissed as archaic metal by arrogant alien cadets, becomes the instrument that rewrites everything they thought they knew about warfare, honor, and what it truly means to be a warrior in this cold universe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine training grounds of the Galactic Military Academy, its rays glinting off the crystalline spires that house the most advanced combat training facilities in known space. Instructor Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the sparring arena, her weathered hands resting on the pommel of an ancient katana that hung at her side. The blade was a relic from old Earth, its steel forged in traditional methods that predated humanity's first contact with alien civilizations by centuries. Around her, cadets from dozens of species prepared for the day's combat assessment. The Zephyrians flexed their forearms, each equipped with energy gauntlets that could shatter reinforced titanium. Tall Korthak warriors checked their plasma spears, weapons that could cut through starship hulls with surgical precision. The crystalline Vexachane polished their bio-integrated weapon symbiotes, living tools that adapted to any combat situation with frightening intelligence. "Look at the human instructor," whispered Cadet Zithkar, a young Korthak whose purple-scaled hide bore the ceremonial scars of his warrior caste. His companions gathered around him, their eyes fixed on Sarah's simple sword, still carrying that primitive metal stick. "Does she think we're going to fight with rocks and pointed sticks?" Cadet Velmora, a Zephyrian female with cybernetic implants along her temple, let out a sound that passed for laughter among her kind. "My grandmother's cooking utensils have more advanced metallurgy than that antique. How did someone so backward become an instructor at the academy?" The group's mockery grew louder, drawing attention from other cadets. Sarah heard every word but remained motionless, her dark eyes scanning the assembled trainees with the patience of someone who had seen far too much to be bothered by juvenile posturing. At 45, she was one of the youngest instructors at the academy, yet her personnel file contained more classified missions than most species encountered in their entire military histories. "Perhaps," said Cadet Thraxus Null, his insectoid mandibles clicking with amusement, "the humans sent her here as some kind of joke, a primitive teaching primitives." The comment sent ripples of barely contained laughter through the alien cadets. Even some of the human trainees shifted uncomfortably, embarrassed by association. Sarah had been at the academy for 3 years and the whispers had never stopped. How had a human with such outdated equipment earned the respect of the academy's command structure? Why did Admiral Krexthul, a Korthak war hero who had fought in the Void campaigns, personally recommend her for the position? Director Vos Ran, a massive Drakmarian whose reptilian features commanded instant respect, stepped onto the training platform. His voice boomed across the arena, silencing the chatter instantly. "Today's assessment will test your understanding of adaptive combat. You will face opponents using unfamiliar fighting styles and weapons you may consider inferior or outdated." The director's golden eyes swept across the assembled cadets before settling on Sarah. "Instructor Chen will demonstrate the importance of never underestimating your enemy based on their apparent technological disadvantage." Zithkar stepped forward, his plasma spear humming with barely contained energy. The weapon was a masterpiece of Korthak engineering, capable of adjusting its energy output from stunning to disintegration with microscopic precision. "With respect, Director, I volunteer to face the human instructor. My people have been perfecting combat techniques for millennia. This should be an educational experience for everyone." Sarah finally moved, stepping into the center of the arena with fluid grace. Her movements were economical, purposeful, like those of a predator conserving energy for the moment of strike. She drew her katana slowly, the sound of steel against wood echoing in the suddenly quiet arena. The blade itself seemed unremarkable to alien eyes. No energy field, no plasma edge, no adaptive smart metal construction. Just folded steel with a mirror polish that reflected the morning light. The cadets could see their own faces in its surface, distorted and alien. "The rules are simple," Director Voss Ran announced. "First to draw blood or force submission wins. Lethal force is prohibited, but this is not a gentle sparring match. You will fight as if your lives depend on the outcome. Zivkar activated his spear's combat mode, energy crackling along its length like captured lightning. He had trained with this weapon since childhood, learning the 47 traditional forms of Korthak spear fighting. His reach advantage was significant, and his plasma blade could cut through most materials known to science. "I'll try not to hurt you too badly, human," he said, falling into a classic attack stance. His fellow cadets cheered their encouragement from the sidelines. Sarah said nothing. She held her katana in a simple middle guard, the blade angled slightly upward, her feet positioned with the subtle precision that spoke of decades of practice. Her breathing was calm, controlled, as if she were meditating rather than preparing for combat. The Korthak cadet struck first, his spear lancing forward in a perfect thrust, aimed at Sarah's center mass. The plasma tip traced a brilliant line through the air, moving with lethal speed and accuracy. Sarah moved like liquid mercury, her body flowing aside as the spear passed harmlessly through the space she had occupied a heartbeat before. Her counterattack came in the same motion, her katana describing a perfect arc that ended with its tip resting against Zivkar's throat, just below his armored collar. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. The arena fell silent. Zivkar stood frozen, his spear extended in a useless thrust while cold steel pressed against his jugular. He could feel the razor edge through his scales, sharp enough to part his flesh with the slightest pressure. "Ow," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah stepped back, lowering her blade with the same fluid motion she had used to draw it. Speed means nothing without precision. Technology means nothing without understanding. Your weapon makes you overconfident. The director nodded approvingly. "Cadet Zivkar, return to formation. Who wishes to be next?" Velmora stepped forward, her forearms moving independently as she activated her energy gauntlets. Each fist crackled with enough power to shatter concrete. Perhaps the Korthak wasn't taking this seriously enough. I won't make the same mistake. The Zephyrian fighting style relied on overwhelming opponents with multiple simultaneous attacks from different angles. Her species' natural ability to control 4 limbs independently made them formidable close combat fighters. Velmora had never lost a sparring match at the academy. She came at Sarah like a hurricane of fists, each gauntlet following a different attack pattern designed to create an inescapable web of destruction. Her movements were precise, calculated, supported by neural implants that enhanced her reaction time beyond normal biological limits. Sarah's response was to become like water, flowing around the attacks rather than meeting them head-on. Her katana moved in tight, economical circles, deflecting energy-charged fists with minimal contact. Each parry redirected force rather than opposing it directly, using Velmora's own power against her. The exchange continued for nearly 30 seconds, the Zephyrian pressing her attack with increasing desperation as none of her strikes found their mark. Her gauntlets left scorch marks on the arena floor where they missed, but Sarah remained untouched. Finally, as Velmora overextended in a quadruple strike combination, Sarah stepped inside her guard. The katana's pommel struck the cadet's solar plexus with surgical precision, dropping her to her knees as her nervous system overloaded from the perfectly placed impact. "Prediction is the enemy of adaptation," Sarah said quietly as Velmora struggled to catch her breath. "You fight the battle you expect, not the one you face." More cadets stepped forward, each confident that their advanced training and superior technology would overcome what they saw as primitive human techniques. A Thorian battle monk with crystalline armor that could absorb and redirect energy attacks. A Nexus collective fighter whose hive mind coordination allowed for perfect tactical awareness. A genetically enhanced super soldier from the Titan colonies whose strength and speed exceeded normal human limits by orders of magnitude. One by one they fell. The Thorian's energy absorption became useless against a weapon that carried no energy signature. The Nexus fighter's hive mind coordination meant nothing when facing an opponent who moved according to principles the collective couldn't predict. The super soldier's enhanced abilities were neutralized by technique that turned strength into weakness and speed into imbalance. Each victory was swift, decisive, and accomplished without apparent effort. Sarah's expression never changed. Her breathing never became labored. Her movements never lost their fluid precision. She fought with the calm of someone for whom violence was not excitement but simply another tool to be applied with professional competence. As the last challenger fell, silence settled over the arena like a heavy blanket. The alien cadets stared at their human instructor with new eyes, seeing her not as a primitive throwback but as something far more dangerous, a master of warfare who needed no technology because she had transcended its limitations. Director Voss's Rand stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the assembled cadets. You have learned your first lesson about humans today. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy, nor the fastest, nor the most technologically advanced, but they possess something that no amount of genetic engineering or technological enhancement can replicate. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. They have the ability to make any tool, any weapon, any situation work in their favor through nothing more than determination, creativity, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Remember this lesson well. Someday, your lives may depend on understanding what humanity truly brings to our alliance. Sarah cleaned her blade with a simple cloth before sheathing it with the same ceremony she had used to draw it. As she walked past the defeated cadets, she spoke quietly enough that only they could hear.
Your weapons are tools.
They are not you. When you understand that difference, you will begin to understand what it means to be truly dangerous. The morning sun had climbed higher during the demonstrations, and its light now fell directly on the Academy's memorial wall, where the names of those who had died defending the galaxy were etched in imperishable stone. Among those thousands of names, a significant percentage bore the simple, unadorned surnames of humanity. As the cadets filed out of the arena, many of them cast backward glances at Sarah's departing figure. The mockery had died completely, replaced by something between respect and unease. They had come to the Academy believing that superior technology and enhanced biology were the keys to military dominance. Today, they had learned that the deadliest weapon in any arsenal was the warrior who wielded it. But they had no idea that what they had witnessed was merely a pale shadow of what Instructor Chen was truly capable of. They didn't know about the classified missions, the impossible victories, or the reason why a human with such a simple weapon commanded such respect from the galaxy's most decorated military leaders. That education would come later, when the real tests began. 3 days after the demonstration, word had spread throughout the Academy like wildfire through dry grass. Cadets who hadn't witnessed the matches demanded detailed accounts from those who had. Training room conversations fell silent when Sarah passed by, and for the first time since her arrival, she noticed alien cadets attempting to study human martial arts videos in the Academy's digital archives. The change was most pronounced among her former challengers. Zithkar had requested additional sessions with human combat instructors, claiming he wanted to understand how his spear techniques could be improved through primitive methodology. Valmora had begun practicing meditation exercises, something her hyper-efficient Zephyrian culture typically dismissed as wasteful. But respect born from defeat could be fragile, and Sarah knew that true understanding required deeper roots. She was reviewing tactical assessments in her modest quarters when her door chimed. The visitor was unexpected. Admiral Krextul himself, the Korthak war hero whose scarred hide told stories of battles across 3 star systems. At nearly 7 feet tall and built like a living fortress, the Admiral commanded respect through presence alone. Instructor Chen, he said, his voice carrying the gravelly undertone of his species. May I enter? Sarah gestured to the simple chair she kept for visitors. The Admiral's massive frame made the furniture seem toy-like, but he settled carefully, mindful not to damage human-sized accommodations. The cadets are talking, Krexthal began without preamble. Your demonstration has them questioning everything they thought they knew about combat effectiveness. Good, Sarah replied simply. Questions lead to growth. The Admiral's golden eyes studied her with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. Some of my colleagues believe you went too easy on them. They think the cadets learned the wrong lesson. Sarah poured tea from a ceramic pot, an Earth tradition she maintained despite being light years from home. The simple ritual gave her time to consider her response. What lesson do they think the cadets learned? That humans are mysteriously superior fighters despite apparent technological disadvantages. That there's some secret technique or hidden enhancement that gives you an edge. Krexthal accepted the offered cup, his clawed hands handling the delicate porcelain with surprising gentleness. They missed the point entirely, which is that you won because you understood your opponents better than they understood themselves. The Admiral sipped his tea, his expression thoughtful. Every species in this galaxy has developed fighting techniques suited to their physiology and mindset. Korthak spearfighting maximizes our reach and strength. Zephyrian multiple-limb combat exploits our natural dexterity. But humans adapt. Sarah nodded slowly. We don't have one optimal fighting style because we don't have one optimal environment. Earth forced us to become generalists. More than that. Krexthal leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. I've read your service record, Instructor. All of it. Including the classified sections. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah's expression didn't change, but her posture shifted slightly, becoming more alert. I wasn't aware those files were accessible to Academy personnel. They're not, normally. But when the Galactic Council decides to place a human instructor at our most prestigious military academy, certain questions get asked, certain backgrounds get investigated. The Admiral set down his teacup with deliberate care. Tell me about Kepler, 442b. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously toward where her katana would normally rest. The name hit her like a physical blow, bringing with it memories she had spent years learning to compartmentalize. Kepler, 442b. The colony world that should have been humanity's shining example of peaceful expansion. The place where everything went wrong. That mission is classified, she said finally. Not to me. I commanded the rescue fleet that arrived 6 months after contact was lost. Krexthal's voice carried the weight of old pain. We found a world that should have been paradise transformed into a charnel house. 3 million colonists dead. The most advanced defensive installations in human space reduced to melted slag. And at the center of it all, evidence of a battle that our best tactical analysts still can't fully explain. Sarah stood and moved to the window, looking out at the Academy's peaceful grounds. Students from a dozen species worked together, trained together, prepared to defend the galaxy together. It was everything Kepler, 442b, should have been. The colony was attacked by the Devourers, she said quietly. A species we'd never encountered before. They came through a dimensional rift, something our scientists insisted was impossible. They moved like living shadows, phased through matter at will, and their weapons dissolved molecular bonds on contact. Our analyst confirmed the weapon signatures. Temporal phased energy disruptors, possibly from another dimension entirely. Every military expert agreed that conventional forces would have been helpless against such technology. The Admiral joined her at the window. Yet someone fought them. Someone held them long enough for the evacuation protocols to activate and preserve the colony's data cores. 73 people, Sarah whispered. That's how many made it to the emergency bunkers. Families mostly, and a few engineers who knew the systems.
And one security consultant.
A human female, with extensive martial arts training and a reputation for unconventional problem-solving. Krexthal's reflection in the window was grim. The forensic evidence showed she fought the Devourers for 6 hours straight using nothing but a traditional earthblade and tactics no military academy teaches. The memory came flooding back despite Sarah's efforts to suppress it. The screaming of the dimensional rifts as they tore reality apart. The sight of plasma rifles and energy barriers failing uselessly against enemies who existed partially outside normal space-time. The horrible moment when she realized that everything humanity had learned about warfare was useless against foes who operated by completely different rules. I had no choice, she said, her voice barely audible. Standard tactics weren't working. Energy weapons passed right through them. Explosive ordnance had no effect. But sometimes when they attacked, they had to solidify completely to interact with our reality. And in those moments, they were vulnerable to a blade that existed entirely in our dimension. Krexthal nodded, understanding. You fought beings from another reality with a weapon that was completely real, completely present, completely committed to this universe. I got lucky, Sarah said, but even she didn't believe it. You adapted. When faced with enemies that had never been encountered before, using weapons that defied known physics, you found a way to hurt them. More than that, you found a way to predict them. The Admiral's voice carried deep respect. The tactical recordings from the colony's defense grid showed patterns in your movements that our best strategists still study. You weren't just fighting individual Devourers. You were fighting their entire tactical doctrine. Sarah turned from the window, her dark eyes meeting the Admiral's golden gaze. They thought like a collective, individual units but coordinated strategy. I realized that if I could disrupt their formation protocols, make them react instead of acting according to plan, they became vulnerable. So you became unpredictable. You abandoned conventional human fighting techniques and created something new in real time, something they couldn't adapt to because it had never existed before. Krexthol's admiration was evident.
That's why you're here, Instructor. Not because you can defeat alien cadets in sparring matches, but because you represent something our alliance desperately needs. Which is the ability to face the unknown and survive. The Admiral moved toward the door, then paused. There are reports coming in from the Outer Rim.
Ships disappearing, colonies going silent, distress signals that cut off mid-transmission. The patterns are familiar. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. The Devourers? We don't know. But whatever it is, it's something we've never faced before. And when the time comes, we're going to need officers who can think beyond their training, beyond their preconceptions, beyond the comfortable certainty of technological superiority. Krextol's hand rested on the door control. We need them to understand what you understand. And what's that? That the deadliest warrior isn't the one with the best weapons or the strongest body or the most advanced training. It's the one who can look at an impossible situation and find a way to make it possible. The Admiral activated the door, then looked back one final time.
The cadets who challenged you learned that their technology has limitations.
That's good, but they need to learn something more important, which is that they don't have limitations, not if they're willing to think like humans. As the door closed behind the Admiral, Sarah returned to her desk and pulled up the Academy's training schedules. If what Krexthor suggested was true, if something was coming that threatened the galaxy again, then her students needed more than demonstrations of superior technique. They needed to learn how to become dangerous in ways their species had never imagined. She began drafting new training protocols, exercises designed not to perfect existing skills but to break them down and rebuild them from first principles. The alien cadets at the Academy were about to discover that their real education was just beginning. Outside her window, the Academy's lights twinkled like stars against the approaching darkness. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that those lights might be the last peaceful sight they would see for a very long time. The galaxy had been at peace for 30 years. In Sarah's experience, peace never lasted forever. And somewhere in the void between stars, something was stirring. Something that would test everything the Academy was trying to teach. Something that would require every species in the Alliance to become more than they had ever been before. The first lesson had been about respect for unexpected opponents. The second lesson would be about becoming unexpected themselves. 2 weeks later, Sarah's new training protocols were causing chaos throughout the Academy. Instead of perfecting traditional combat forms, cadets found themselves facing scenarios that deliberately broke every rule of engagement they had learned. Korthak spearfighters were forced to abandon their weapons mid-battle and adapt to close-quarters grappling. Zephyrian multi-limb specialists had to fight with 3 arms restrained, discovering how to be effective with unexpected limitations. The complaints reached Director Vossesran within days. The cadets are filing formal protests, he informed Sarah during their weekly review meeting. His massive Drakmarian features showed signs of stress that rarely appeared in the species known for their unflappable demeanor. They claim your exercises are counterproductive, that you're teaching them to fight incorrectly. Sarah stood before the holographic display showing Academy-wide performance metrics. Most categories showed declining scores as cadets struggled with unfamiliar challenges. What does their performance data actually show? Vossran manipulated the display, highlighting adaptation speed measurements. Slower initial response times, higher failure rates in standard combat assessments significantly increased stress levels across all species. He paused. But also, something unprecedented. The hologram shifted to show problem-solving analytics. Where traditional academy training produced steady, predictable improvement curves, Sarah's students showed wild fluctuations that gradually stabilized at levels higher than standard graduates. They're learning to learn, she said quietly, not just memorizing optimal responses to known threats. The Academy Board doesn't care about theoretical improvements. They care about producing officers who can pass standardized evaluations and command respect from established military hierarchies. Vossran's tone carried warning. I've bought you time by emphasizing your combat demonstration, but patience is wearing thin. Sarah nodded, understanding, but her expression remained determined. Director, with respect, we're training for the last war instead of the next one. Every species in this alliance has developed military doctrine based on fighting enemies they understand. What happens when we face something completely alien? We adapt using established protocols. Military science has developed systematic approaches to encountering unknown threats. Voss Rand called up tactical doctrine databases, their contents representing centuries of combined military experience from dozens of species. Those protocols assume the unknown threats will operate according to recognizable principles. Physics we understand, tactics that make logical sense, motivations we can comprehend. Sarah gestured at her katana. This blade exists because my ancestors faced threats that couldn't be defeated with the weapons and tactics of their time. They didn't develop new technology. They developed new thinking. Before Voss Rand could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the academy. Emergency lighting bathed the office in red as automated systems announced, Priority 1 alert. All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. The two officers rushed to the academy's command center, where Admiral Krextel was coordinating response to whatever crisis had triggered the alert. The main display showed a star map of the outer rim sectors, several systems highlighted in ominous red. Report, Voss Rand demanded as they entered. 3 colonies have gone completely silent in the past 6 hours, Admiral Krextel said without turning from the displays. Epsilon Eridani, Ross 128, and Wolf 359, all heavily defended systems with state-of-the-art early warning networks. Sarah felt cold recognition settle in her stomach. Communication jamming? No, the networks are still active, still transmitting, but they're not transmitting anything coherent. The Admiral called up audio feeds from the affected systems. Static filled the command center, but underneath it, something else could be heard. A rhythmic pulsing that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the listener's bones. That's not interference, Sarah whispered. That's translation. Every officer in the command center turned to stare at her. The Admiral's scarred features showed grim understanding. You've heard this before. Kepler 442b. Right before the dimensional rifts opened, Sarah moved to the tactical console, her hands flying over controls with practiced efficiency. The Devourers don't just attack physically, they attack conceptually. They break down the fundamental relationships that hold reality together. The main display shifted to show energy readings from the affected systems. Patterns of distortion rippled through space-time itself, creating zones where physical laws became unreliable. Gravity fluctuated wildly. Light bent in impossible directions. Matter occasionally failed to maintain cohesion. This is impossible, declared Commander Fexnell, the Academy's chief tactical instructor. His insectoid features clicked with agitation. Our sensors must be malfunctioning. Reality doesn't work that way. Our reality doesn't work that way, Sarah corrected. But the Devourers come from somewhere else, somewhere with different rules. When they enter our space, they bring their rules with them. Admiral Krextel called up fleet deployment orders. I'm mobilizing everything we have. Full battle groups from 3 sectors, every advanced warship in the Alliance fleet. They won't be enough, Sarah said quietly. Advanced weapons, superior technology, overwhelming firepower. None of that matters against an enemy that can make your weapons stop existing. The command center fell silent, except for the ominous pulsing from the outer rim. Every officer present represented the pinnacle of their species' military evolution, but they were facing something that made their expertise irrelevant. Director Voss Rand broke the silence. What do you recommend, Instructor? Sarah looked around the room at faces representing a dozen species, each shaped by different evolutionary pressures, different survival strategies, different approaches to conflict resolution. We need to do what my students have been learning. We need to stop thinking like ourselves and start thinking like humans. Explain, the Admiral demanded. Every species here has optimal fighting methods based on your biology and psychology. Korthak spear techniques maximize reach and leverage. Drakmarian tactics emphasize defensive positioning and overwhelming firepower. Zephyrian combat doctrine exploits superior dexterity and coordination. Sarah called up Academy training records. But humans don't have one optimal method. We have whatever works. She manipulated the display to show historical human conflicts. When we faced cavalry, we developed pike formations. When we faced armor, we developed crossbows. When we faced castles, we developed cannons. We didn't perfect one approach. We constantly changed approaches. The Devourers expect resistance based on technological superiority and established military doctrine, Admiral Krextel said, understanding dawning in his voice. They've encountered our standard forces before and know how to counter them, but they haven't encountered improvised responses from species thinking outside their evolutionary programming. Sarah brought up the Academy's student roster. The cadets have been learning to fight beyond their natural limitations. They've been learning to be unpredictable. Commander Thexnell's mandibles clicked skeptically. You're suggesting we send students into combat against an enemy that destroyed 3 defended star systems? I'm suggesting we send graduates who understand that their training is a starting point, not a limitation. Sarah turned to face the assembled officers. The Academy has always taught cadets to be better versions of what they already are. But against the Devourers, being better isn't enough. They need to be different. Director Vosran studied the tactical displays, his massive features thoughtful. Even if your theory is correct, we have perhaps days before the Devourers reach core systems. You can't retrain the entire fleet in that time. No, Sarah agreed. But I can train a strike force. Volunteers from each species who are willing to abandon everything they think they know about warfare and learn to fight like humans. The Admiral's expression showed deep skepticism. A small, mixed-species unit using improvised tactics against an enemy that has defeated our best fleets? It worked on Kepler. 442b, Sarah reminded him. One human with a primitive weapon held off an entire Devourer assault force long enough to save 73 lives. You were lucky, Commander Thexnell objected. I was adaptable, Sarah corrected. Luck runs out. Adaptability doesn't. Admiral Krexthal studied the energy readings from the outer rim, watching as reality itself bent and twisted under the influence of forces that shouldn't exist. How long would you need? 72 hours. Long enough to break them down and rebuild them as something the Devourers have never faced. That's not enough time to properly train. It's enough time to teach them to stop being properly trained, Sarah interrupted. The Devourers can predict responses based on optimal tactical doctrine. They can't predict responses based on desperation, creativity, and complete willingness to redefine the rules of engagement. The command center fell silent as each officer contemplated what Sarah was proposing. She was asking them to gamble the survival of civilization on the untested theory that amateur improvisation could succeed where professional competence had failed. Director Vosran spoke first. I'll authorize the formation of an experimental tactical unit, volunteers only, with full disclosure of the risks involved. Admiral Krexthal nodded slowly. I'll provide transportation and logistical support. But Instructor Chen, if this fails, we'll all be dead anyway, Sarah replied with quiet certainty. The Devourers don't take prisoners and they don't leave survivors. They consume realities, not just civilizations. As alarms continued to sound throughout the Academy, Sarah began mentally cataloguing which cadets had shown the greatest aptitude for abandoning their preconceptions. The volunteers she would need weren't necessarily the best fighters by traditional standards. They were the ones who had learned to fight worst by traditional standards while succeeding anyway. In 72 hours, she would either forge them into something unprecedented in galactic military history or watch them die alongside everything else worth protecting. The third lesson was about to begin. Sometimes the only way to win is to stop trying to win according to the rules everyone else recognizes. The volunteers gathered in Academy Hangar 7 at 0400 hours, their faces showing mixtures of determination, confusion, and barely controlled fear. Sarah had chosen 12 cadets from 7 different species, each selected not for their military excellence, but for their demonstrated ability to succeed through unconventional methods. Zythkar stood among them, the Korthak warrior who had first challenged Sarah's blade. Beside him was Velmora, the Zephyrian whose forearmed combat style had been systematically dismantled in their previous encounter. The group included Nexus collective fighter Syndra, whose hive mind coordination had proven useless against unpredictable human tactics. Each volunteer represented their species' military elite, yet each had learned through painful experience that elite training could become a limitation. In 68 hours, Sarah began without preamble. You will face an enemy that has destroyed 3 star systems using weapons that break the fundamental laws of physics. Your traditional training is not only useless against such foes, it's actively harmful. It makes you predictable. She gestured to a collection of primitive weapons arranged on a nearby table. Swords, clubs, spears, and other implements that predated spaceflight were mixed with impromptu tools, maintenance equipment, cooking utensils, and various objects never intended for combat. For the next 68 hours, you will not use energy weapons, smart ammunition, or any device more technologically advanced than basic mechanical principles. You will learn to fight with whatever is available, using methods your species never developed.
Cadet Morthak, a massive Thorian whose crystalline armor could deflect starship weapons, raised his hand tentatively.
Instructor, how can primitive tools be effective against enemies that can phase through matter? Because they're not primitive, Sarah replied, hefting a simple steel hammer. They're pure.
When the Devourers destabilize reality, energy weapons become unreliable. Smart systems develop contradictory instructions.
Advanced materials lose cohesion. But a hammer remains a hammer. A blade remains a blade. They exist in our reality completely, without dependencies on technologies that can be corrupted. She moved to the center of the hangar, where Academy engineers had constructed an obstacle course unlike anything in standard training protocols. Instead of optimized challenges designed to test specific skills, the course appeared to be a chaotic collection of random barriers, moving platforms and environmental hazards that changed configuration every few minutes.
Your first exercise is simple, Sarah announced. Get from here to the far end of the course. There are no rules except this. If you use the same method twice, you fail. The cadets exchanged uncertain glances. Standard Academy training emphasized perfecting optimal techniques through repetition until they became instinctive. Sarah was asking them to abandon repetition entirely. Syndra, the Nexus collective fighter, stepped forward first. Her species' shared consciousness allowed for perfect tactical coordination, but it also meant they typically approached problems through established protocols. She studied the course with her enhanced sensory organs, mapping optimal pathways and calculating efficiency ratings.
Stop thinking, Sarah called out.
Start moving. The instruction violated every military principle Syndra had been taught, but she forced herself to act before her analysis could be completed. She grabbed a maintenance ladder and used it to bridge the first gap, then abandoned it to crawl under a spinning barrier.
When she encountered a wall too high to climb normally, she used a discarded energy cell casing as a stepping stone. Her progress was erratic, inefficient, and completely unpredictable. She succeeded not because of superior planning, but because she refused to let setbacks stop her momentum.
Better, Sarah said as Syndra reached the end.
But you're still thinking too much. Zithkar, your turn.
The Korthak warrior approached the course with typical directness, intending to bull his way through obstacles using sheer strength. When that approach failed at the first spinning barrier, he had to improvise. He found himself using acrobatic movements his species had never developed, turning his spear fighter's balance training into something resembling parkour. By the end of the first day, every volunteer had completed the course successfully, but none had used methods their instructors would recognize. More importantly, none could explain exactly how they had succeeded.
"This is insane," Delmora complained during their brief rest period. "We're abandoning everything that makes us effective fighters." "You're abandoning everything that makes you predictable fighters," Sarah corrected.
Effectiveness against unknown enemies requires flexibility above competence. The second day brought more extreme challenges. Sarah paired cadets from different species and forced them to fight using their partner's traditional weapons and techniques.
Zithkar found himself attempting Zephyrian four-limb coordination with only two arms. Delmora struggled to adapt Korthak spear techniques to a multi-limb physiology. The results were disasters by any conventional measurement, but failures forced innovation, and innovation forced growth beyond species-typical limitations.
"I can't fight like a Thorian,"
Syndra protested after a particularly frustrating sparring session. "My body isn't built for their combat style."
"Exactly," Sarah replied. "So create something new.
Take their strengths and adapt them to your physiology. Make something that has never existed before." Gradually, the volunteers began developing hybrid fighting styles that drew from multiple species traditions while being limited by none. Zithkar incorporated Zephyrian coordination principles into Korthak spearwork, creating attack patterns that no enemy would expect from a two-armed fighter. Delmora learned to use Thorian defensive positioning to set up devastating multi-limb combinations. But the real breakthrough came during the third day, when Sarah introduced them to human military history.
Every human conflict has been between opponents using similar technologies and operating under similar assumptions, she explained while displaying historical battles on holographic projectors. Victory went to whoever could think beyond those assumptions fastest. She showed them the Battle of Agincourt, where English longbowmen defeated heavily armored French cavalry by using terrain and weather conditions the knights hadn't prepared for. She displayed the Normandy landings, where Allied forces succeeded not through superior technology, but through superior deception and misdirection. In every case, Sarah emphasized, the winning side succeeded by making the enemy's strengths irrelevant, while exploiting weaknesses the enemy didn't know they had. Cadet Threng Jul, whose insectoid physiology made him naturally suited for infiltration and reconnaissance, raised a claw hesitantly. But humans were fighting other humans. Similar biology, similar psychology, similar tactical thinking. How does this apply to beings from another dimension? Because the Devourers make the same mistake every advanced species makes, Sarah replied. They assume their advantages are permanent and absolute. They've learned to counter our best efforts, our most sophisticated weapons, our most brilliant tactical innovations. But they've never encountered our worst efforts. She gestured to the volunteers, who after 3 days of unconventional training looked like military disaster survivors rather than elite academy graduates. Their uniforms were torn, their equipment was improvised, and their fighting styles were unrecognizable amalgamations of techniques that should never work together. "Look at yourselves," Sarah said. "You've become something your own species wouldn't recognize. Your techniques are inefficient by standard measures. Your equipment is primitive. Your tactics violate established doctrine." She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. "And you're more dangerous than you've ever been in your lives." The truth of her statement was undeniable. Despite using inferior equipment and abandoning optimal techniques, each volunteer had shown improvement in adaptability, creativity, and problem-solving under pressure. More importantly, they had learned to succeed despite failing by traditional standards. "The final phase of your training begins now," Sarah announced. "You will face simulated Devourer attacks using Academy holographic systems. But the simulations will be programmed with random factors that change constantly. You cannot prepare for specific threats because the threats will become something different while you're fighting them." Admiral Krexthol materialized in the hangar, his scarred features grim. "Instructor, I need to interrupt. Long-range sensors have detected dimensional distortions moving toward the core systems. We have 18 hours before they reach inhabited space." The hangar fell silent as the implications hit. 18 hours was not enough time to complete training. It was barely enough time to reach the battle zone. Sarah looked at her volunteers, 12 young beings who had spent 3 days learning to abandon everything their species had taught them about warfare. They were as ready as they would ever be. "Change of plans," she said quietly. "Your final examination will be conducted under live fire conditions." As the volunteers filed toward the waiting transport, each clutched weapons that would have seemed laughably primitive just days ago, but they also carried something more valuable than advanced technology. The knowledge that limitations could be transcended, that rules could be rewritten, and that survival sometimes required becoming something unprecedented. The fourth lesson was complete. When facing impossible odds, become impossible yourself. The transport ship Defiant Unity dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Tau Ceti system, where reality itself was under attack. Through the viewports, the volunteers could see space-time bending like heated glass, creating impossible geometries where starlight traced spirals through folded dimensions. The system's defensive fleet floated dead in the void, their hulls intact but their crews vanished, as if erased from existence rather than killed. "Energy readings are completely unstable," reported the ship's Drekmarian pilot, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Gravity fluctuates between 0 and 15 standard units every few seconds. Electromagnetic spectrum is, I don't have words for what it's doing." Sarah studied the tactical displays from the transport's cramped command center. The Devourers had arrived in force. Dozens of entities that existed partially outside normal space-time, appearing as shifting shadows that occasionally solidified into forms that hurt to look at directly. They moved through the dying fleet like sharks through blood-tinted water, consuming more than just matter. They were consuming the fundamental concepts that held reality together. "Landing coordinates?" the pilot asked. "The primary colony on Tau Ceti Prime," Sarah replied. "Whatever population remains will be in the emergency shelters. We need to reach them before the Devourers break through the last defensive barriers." The descent through the planet's atmosphere was a nightmare of shifting gravitational fields and electromagnetic chaos. The transport systems failed repeatedly, forcing the pilot to navigate using manual controls and intuition. When they finally reached the surface, the landing was less controlled crash than controlled descent. Tau Ceti Prime's capital city was a surreal hellscape where buildings phased in and out of existence. their molecular structure destabilized by proximity to the Devourer's reality-distorting presence. Streets led to nowhere, gravity sometimes pulled sideways, and the sky occasionally displayed colors that had no names in any galactic language. The volunteers emerged from their damaged transport armed with primitive weapons and improvised equipment, facing an enemy that had destroyed the galaxy's most advanced military forces. By every logical measure, they should have been dead within minutes. Instead, they adapted. When Zithkar encountered a devourer that phased through his initial spear thrust, he didn't retreat or attempt the same attack again. Instead, he used his weapon's wooden shaft to trip the creature during its brief moment of solidity, then struck with a maintenance wrench he'd grabbed from the ship's emergency kit. The crude improvisation worked where advanced plasma weapons had failed. Velmora faced a group of devourers using her species' traditional forearm coordination, but when they predicted and countered her movements, she immediately switched to fighting like a Thorian, using only two arms while the others created distraction. The sudden change in fighting style confused the entities long enough for her to land decisive strikes with a simple steel pipe. Sindra discovered that her collective consciousness species' greatest weakness became a strength against enemies who operated by incomprehensible logic. When she stopped trying to understand devourer tactics and simply reacted on pure instinct, her responses became genuinely unpredictable. But the real test came when they reached the colony's central emergency shelter, where 15,000 civilians waited behind barriers that were failing rapidly. The shelter's defensive systems had been designed to withstand conventional attacks, but the devourers were dissolving the barrier's molecular bonds through methods that violated known physics. Estimated time until barrier failure, Sarah asked the shelter's automated systems. 12 minutes 47 seconds, came the mechanical response. Recommend immediate evacuation to secondary positions. There are no secondary positions, Sarah replied grimly. The entire planet was under attack, and their transport was too damaged for immediate departure. The volunteers formed a defensive perimeter outside the failing barrier, 12 young beings with primitive weapons facing an enemy that had consumed entire star systems. The tactical situation was beyond hopeless. It was completely absurd, which Sarah realized was exactly what they needed. Remember your training, she called out as the first devourers approached. Don't fight them. Fight the idea of them. The advice sounded like mystical nonsense, but the volunteers understood. They had spent 3 days learning to abandon logical approaches in favor of whatever worked. Against enemies that existed partially outside logic, illogical responses became the only effective strategy. The battle that followed defied every principle of military science. Cadet Morthak used his crystalline armor not for protection but as a resonating surface, striking it with metal tools to create sound frequencies that seemed to disrupt devourer coherence. Drexel abandoned his species' infiltration instincts and began making as much noise as possible, apparently confusing entities that fed on concealment and shadow. But it was Sarah herself who demonstrated the true purpose of her ancient blade. As the largest devourer, a nightmare entity that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously, approached the shelter. Sarah stepped forward to meet it. The creature towered above her, its form shifting between states of matter, its presence causing reality to ripple and bend around it. The entity struck with weapons that existed outside conventional spacetime, attacks that should have passed through any defense. But Sarah's katana was there to meet them. Steel that existed completely and absolutely in one reality, with no complex systems to be corrupted or advanced principles to be subverted. More than that, the blade carried something the devourers had never encountered. The accumulated weight of human determination refined through centuries of conflict. Every fold in its steel represented battles fought against impossible odds. Every imperfection in its edge was a reminder that perfection was less important than persistence. When the Devourer's reality-bending attacks met the sword's absolute commitment to existing in baseline physics, the collision created something unprecedented. The creature's form stabilized, forced into single-dimensional existence by contact with something that refused to acknowledge alternative realities. For the first time since arriving in the galaxy, a Devourer looked genuinely surprised. Sarah pressed her attack, not with superior technique, but with complete tactical unpredictability. She abandoned Japanese sword-fighting principles mid-strike and switched to Korthak spear techniques, then to Zephyrian multi-limb coordination adapted for 2 arms, then to movements she improvised on the spot, drawing from every fighting style she'd ever encountered while following none of them completely. The Devourer couldn't adapt to her attacks because her attacks weren't following any consistent system. She was fighting like a human, using whatever worked while discarding whatever didn't, changing approaches faster than any enemy could counter them. Around the shelter, the other volunteers followed her example. They stopped trying to be perfect representatives of their species' military traditions and started being imperfect representatives of something new. Their techniques were messy, inefficient, and completely impossible to predict. The Devourers, creatures that had consumed realities by understanding and subverting the rules that governed them, found themselves facing opponents who refused to follow any rules at all. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the shelter's barriers had held, the surviving population was safe, and the Devourers had retreated, not defeated, but frustrated by enemies they couldn't comprehend. As emergency reinforcements finally arrived to evacuate the colonists, Admiral Crextel found Sarah sitting on the shelter's steps, cleaning her blade with the same careful ritual she had performed after the Academy demonstration weeks earlier. "Your tactical report will be interesting reading," he said, settling his massive frame beside her. Sarah looked up at the sky, where reality was slowly returning to normal as the Devourer influence faded. "What's to report? 12 cadets with primitive weapons held off an enemy that destroyed our best fleets. How? We stopped trying to be what we were supposed to be and started being what we needed to be." Sarah sheathed her katana with practiced precision. The Devourers can predict responses based on optimal doctrine. They can't predict responses based on determination to survive regardless of doctrine. Admiral Crextel studied the abandoned battlefield where evidence of the strangest military engagement in galactic history lay scattered in the form of improvised weapons and impossible victory. "The Academy Board will want to analyze your training methods." "They can try," Sarah replied with quiet amusement. "But you can't systematize the abandonment of systems. You can't create doctrine for ignoring doctrine. The moment you make adaptability into a rule, it stops being adaptability. Then how do we prepare for the next Devourer attack?" Sarah stood, shouldering her simple pack and preparing to return to the transport. "We teach every species in the Alliance what my students learned, that their greatest strength isn't what they're best at, it's what they're capable of becoming when being their best isn't enough." As they walked through the recovering city, past buildings that were slowly remembering how to maintain consistent molecular structure, Admiral Crextel asked one final question. "Your blade. What makes it so effective against enemies that can phase through energy weapons and advanced armor?" Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to the katana's worn grip. "It's not the blade that's effective. It's the willingness to use whatever weapon you have, however inadequate it seems, with complete commitment to achieving the impossible." Quote. She paused, looking back at the shelter where 15,000 lives had been saved by 12 young beings who had learned to fight beyond their limitations. That's what humans bring to this alliance. Not superior technology or enhanced biology or advanced tactical doctrine. We bring the absolute refusal to accept that any situation is hopeless, any enemy is invincible, or any limitation is permanent. The Academy had taught its cadets to be perfect examples of their species' military capabilities. Sarah had taught them something far more valuable: how to transcend those capabilities when perfection wasn't enough. As word of their victory spread throughout the galaxy, military academies from every species began requesting information about human training methods. They wanted to understand how primitive weapons and improvised tactics had succeeded where advanced technology had failed. But the real lesson couldn't be taught through traditional methods. It could only be learned by those willing to abandon everything they thought they knew about warfare and discover what lay beyond the boundaries of their species' military evolution. In the end, Sarah's blade had served its true purpose, not as a weapon, but as a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful tool isn't the most advanced one, it's the one wielded by someone who refuses to accept defeat, regardless of the odds. The final lesson was complete. When facing the impossible, become impossible yourself, and in that transformation, discover that impossibility is just another limitation waiting to be transcended.